Hey there, Gothamites. Brian Ward here with a very special episode of the Arkham Sessions. This is our panel from Easter Sunday at WonderCon, held as always in Anaheim, California. WonderCon is easily one of our favorite conventions, if not our favorite convention of the year. It's right across from Disneyland. There's lots to do in Anaheim, some wonderful sort of social hub areas where people can leave the convention and go hang out together. We get an opportunity to see some old and new friends, get to meet some of you listeners. We have so much fun at WonderCon. This year was really special for us because, as you know, we are currently covering X-Men the Animated Series from 1992 and 1993. The first season crossed over between years. And there is currently a new animated series on Disney Plus that is a direct sequel to that animated series. It's called X-Men 97. I'm sure you've heard of it. I'm sure most of you are watching it. If you aren't, you absolutely need to go check out X-Men 97. It is not a reboot. It is not a reimagining of the original animated series. It is a direct continuation taking place days after the series finale in 1996. Now, that was one of the things we wanted to talk about. So much has changed since the show ended in 1996. It is now 2024. We wanted to ask the writers how they approached going back and continuing stories that took place, you know, in the middle of Gulf Wars, pre-9/11, all of the various injustices that have taken place since. They still need to figure out ways to inject those same moral lessons into the animated series. And so we had some very special guests join us. One of those special guests was X-Men 97 writer JB Ballard. He kills it on this panel. I think you're going to love hearing what he has to say about working on the new animated series. We also have our very dear friends Eric and Julia Lewald. Now, you've heard their names several times over the course of our podcast. We've had them on panels in the past, but now because we are covering X-Men, the animated series, we wanted to talk to the two people who made it possible. Eric was, of course, basically the showrunner of that original animated series, and Julia was also a writer on the show. They have a lot of wonderful things to say, especially since they also helped by consulting on X-Men 97. So it was fantastic to have the two generations of writers there with us on the panel. We were also joined by our dear friend, David Nett. He is the co-founder of Hero's Journey Fitness, a gym located here in Burbank, California that caters to folks of the geeky variety in so many ways. But he also happens to be maybe one of the most knowledgeable people about X-Men I have ever met. And he is a diehard Cyclops fan. So we knew he would be really valuable on a panel like this where we're diving into the psychology of these characters. And Cyclops, love him or hate him, is one of those people that we really wanted to take a nice dive into examining. This panel was wonderfully successful. It was a full room on Easter Sunday, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We were so happy to see everyone show up and seem to have a really good time. And we want to thank you now for listening to this panel. If you like it, let us know by dropping a comment anywhere that you can find us, because we're really contemplating continuing this conversation down the line at a future convention. Who knows, maybe even San Diego Comic-Con. So let us know what you think. Until then, here is Dr. Drea Letamendi and myself hosting The Arkham Sessions, Examining the X-Men.
First things first, I just want to say Eric and Julia have done an amazing job of making sure this fandom stays alive over the years at a time that they kind of felt like, you know, they may have been abandoned. You couldn't find the show on streaming. You couldn't find it on DVD. They decided to just go into their archives and start writing books about their experience. And as a result, I think we have two amazing references. There's previously on X-Men, the making of an animated series. It's basically a textbook. If you've ever wanted to write an animated series, this is what you want. And then there is X-Men, the art and making of the animated series, because basically Eric and Julia kept everything. And they are both phenomenal. We use them regularly in our analysis of the X-Men on our podcast. For starters, I just wanted to ask the panel, why X-Men? What makes their stories so enduring, and what brought you to that particular collection of heroes to begin with? Let's start with Eric.
Okay, sure. Absolutely fabulously dumb luck brought me to those people. I'd worked with the person that made X-Men happen is a wonderful lady named Margaret Lesh, and you don't find the talent praising the executives very often, but in this case, it's absolutely earned. For 10 years, she tried to get this she worked for Marvel, she worked for Hanna-Barbera, she tried to get the show on there, and no one in Hollywood would touch it, and just thought, oh, some silly comic book characters, nobody's going to watch that on Saturday morning. Shows the collected wisdom of Hollywood at the time. And February 92, she had gotten herself in a position where she was president of the new TV network, Fox Kids, and her biggest, her first show, she knew she was going to want to get on there was X-Men. Well, I had worked for her right-hand man, a guy named Sidney Iwander, on 2 or 3 things. And one of them, the recent one, was Beetlejuice for Fox. So that's how Margaret knew my writing voice. And she looked at Sidney and said, okay, we got 3 or 4 people that could do this. Who do you want to work with? And Sidney said, it's Eric, and that's it. When I got the call the night before meeting Stan Lee and Chaim Saban to do the show, they called me and said, you're going to be doing X-Men, and I said, that's a Marvel book, right? I didn't know. I had a lot of years of writing heroic stories. I loved writing action, and I loved working for the people at Fox, but I had to learn X-Men on the fly and pretend to these, in front of Stan Lee and everyone, oh yeah, I've got a great idea for your show. But again, learned it quickly. So that's how I got there, was through having worked with the people that made it possible.
And I also got to work on it by working with people before who made it possible. Eric and I met at Disney, doing the Disney Afternoon, good old Chippendales Rescue Rangers, Darkwing Duck, all those shows. Love that time. And then transitioning into the world of freelance and then getting an opportunity on X-Men. Margaret Lesh, the marching orders were, you are not going to write down to kids, you're going to write up. You pretend this is an hour-length primetime drama with live actors. That's what you're going for here. I had never had that opportunity before, and I to this day, for me, that's what X-Men is, the telling of human stories with a lot of explosions and interesting colors and stuff, but it really is the human story that, to me, is so compelling.
I'm probably like a lot of people in this room where I just read comics at a young age, like age 10. My dad got me into Black Panther and X-Men and Spider-Man, and I read voraciously, and I grew up in this world. And when I went to college, I made a friend who ended up working at Marvel, and I told him I loved Marvel more than anything in the world. And he's like, I'll keep an eye out for you. And I worked my way up in the industry, and when I was an assistant, he said, hey, we're hiring for this show called Moon Knight. And I was like, yes, please, give me an interview on that show. and I got an interview on that show, and I ended up working on that show, and it was an incredible writer's room, and I hope some of you have seen it. It's an awesome show.
So good.
And I loved working at Marvel, and then they had another show called X-Men '97, and they asked if I wanted to come do that, and I'm like, I've read those comics since I was 10, please let me work on it, and that's the story for me. I'm very lucky to have gotten to work on it.
Fantastic.
I mean, for me, so my only work in the X-Men world is wearing a Cyclops costume on Signal Boost when I was working at Geek and Sundry, but that was my Cyclops costume. I want to make it clear. It was not something given to me by wardrobe. I own that Cyclops costume. I'm a huge X-Men fan from when I was a little kid as well, reading the comics in the early 80s. I remember the covers of the first issues that I read. I loved comics in general, but the Cyclops, the X-Men really spoke to me, and I think it's, I was a nerdy little outcast kid in farm country in North Dakota, and the outcast nature of the X-Men always spoke to me. It maybe seems a little cliched, but that's really what brought me in and kept me with them.
I want to ask our writers.
Can I answer this question?
Oh, you are more than welcome.
Some people ask me, so how does a psychologist get involved or get immersed in comics? I'm like, no, you have it twisted. Comics, the narratives and storytelling in comics is what led me to really become inspired about the human story. And that's what led me to be interested in clinical psychology and get a PhD and become a clinical psychologist. And so it's really, I feel very lucky to be now coming full circle and having these discussions, having dialogue, talking to writers and consulting in entertainment media to talk about how rich and dynamic these stories and these characters can be and how they impact us in our very, real experiences, our real traumas, our real adversities. And it's so interesting to hear David talk about what connected him as a kid to X-Men, because we actually had very similar, we had probably different upbringings, different experiences growing up, but the way you talked about it is the same way I would talk about it. I was this kind of like misfit kid in the early 90s watching Batman the Animated Series and X-Men the Animated Series, yes. And as a mixed race Latina girl growing up in the Valley in SoCal, I wasn't sure that I really fit in, and these characters just really spoke to me. They're very relatable, and again, dynamic features that were so foregrounded in these stories. There wasn't anything kind of like subtle or subtext. The directness and the text of X-Men especially is about bringing that adversity to the foreground. And for a lot of us kids around that era, it really helped us believe, just be you. Just being you is enough, and you can belong in this world, and that's such an important message from this.
I want to ask our writers, when you are tasked with putting an episode or a show in general together, how important is it for you to try to maintain integrity when it comes to real psychologically driven characters as opposed to simply motivation A versus B? How important is that for you?
Well, for us, it was really crucially important. I mean, we've all written on numbers of shows before, and some of them are very superficial, and that's all that they really want. But we were given this opportunity with X-Men that, in effect, we're casting a bunch of 20-somethings and Jubilee and Professor X, but we're casting this group of adults that we wanted. The best way for us to write the best stories we could write was to give them real human problems, and for us to just get in the mind and the heart and the soul of each one of them as we're writing them. So it was such a gift from Fox to be told, yes, write them that way, or write them like you're writing an R-rated movie. I mean, don't make this a little kiddie show. Don't pretend that there's going to be a lot of things that you're going to write that the youngest ones aren't going to get the first time they see it, but their older brother will get it, or their older sister will get it, and they'll get it when they get older. And so it was the biggest gift of any series any of us had worked on, to be offered that opportunity. And what he said is right. That's why we wrote the stories. We started off deciding which stories to tell, and there are thousands, in the books or in real life, to say, okay, what is the most intense beast story we could tell? And we built the stories from the characters. And other people, might have been more interested in the spectacle or the competition among super powerful people, but to us it was just, these are real adults having real personal problems. They just happened to have this job rather than another job, and that was always our focus.
JB, how do you feel going into '97? Obviously, a lot has happened in the world since '96. We've now seen multiple wars. Unfortunately, 9/11. Unfortunately, racism and prejudice have spiked in recent years. How does X-Men '97 manage to stay as relevant today for today's audience while also trying to pick up only a few days after the original series ended?
It's a balancing act, for sure, but it was a challenge that I think we approached head on. I feel like we're all aware in 2024 what the real world is like, and we also are aware of what it was like in 1997 for our characters. There's a line in the original series where Storm time travels and is in the 1960s and says, "A skin-based prejudice, how quaint." And I think everyone in the room was aware, like, we had to address that in 1997 while still thinking about what it's like now. If anyone's seen the show, in the second episode, we have, a big riot that happens at the United Nations Assembly Hall, very reminiscent of real life events, of course, and that's the way to address it. I think there's like a middle ground where you're not like on the nose, but you're in that realm and people hopefully can appreciate what you're trying to say.
I'm curious about like the concept of a writer's Bible. We've explained it on our show before, this idea that a showrunner then has to put together a document that all the writers on the show then have to adhere to, so that every voice of every episode feels the same and like it's in the same universe. JB, how closely did the show adhere to the original, maybe, writer's Bible that Eric had put together in '92?
I could probably write a thesis on the original series because I've seen it 9,000 times as a child and as an adult. So when I say we adhered to it as much as we could, we watched it religiously. In the room, outside of the room, I could probably quote episodes from front to back to you in all earnest. And I think that was how we wanted to use it as a blueprint. One of our executives referred to our show not as a reboot, but as a rejuvenation, and I really like that term.
Oh, that's fantastic. Drea, now onto the heavy lifting for you. What do you see in X-Men, not just the animated series, but in general, this group that you think gets psychology right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mentioned that there's this very clear directness about centering adversity and trauma for these characters, and you see that from the beginning of both parallel series. The thing too is that this really isn't necessarily a story where you have pity and feel sorry for these characters because you see so much triumph. This is about resiliency. This is about overcoming obstacles. This is about overcoming perspectives that are oppressive, that are marginalized, that really kind of bring to light something that I feel really is important that we've talked about on our show, that the lens is not so much about the trauma itself. The lens is about sort of the interpretation and the aftermath of these times and these different challenges that the X-Men are facing. So, for instance, I think folks know that many of the mutants have these non-human phenotypes where, you look at them and you see they have blue-colored skin, or they have a tail, or they have, what is coded for non-mutants as these beastly, monstrous, and then we get into the deeper allegories here. That means they're evil, that means they're subhuman, that means that they're abominations, so there's some sort of religious undertones here that come into play. And what's really interesting too is that mutants can also pass. So you have mutants with what we would consider, for those of us who have invisible disabilities or invisible parallels to this, folks who are shapeshifters, folks who can kind of work in these liminal spaces and navigate the in-betweenness of the society that claims there is, this or that, one category, the subhuman category, and, the folks that deserve civil rights, right? So we see this sort of, this coding here around people's identity development and experiences. And it's such a just wonderful, lovely narrative around how different mutants navigate their experiences. And that's very similar to what a lot of us are experiencing. Some of us can pass, some of us cannot pass. Some of us are dealing with what, we feel is our authentic identities and how much we can represent that and present that to the world. And I mentioned this on the show as well, that what this does probably so much, I don't want to say maybe better than some of the comics that I've read or some of the animated series that I've seen, is that it really lifts up liberation psychology. I'm someone who practices liberation psychology, and this is the notion and the approach to psychology that sometimes our well-being, a lot of times our well-being is a function or an outcome of our environment, our let's say our social environment, these social determinants or contributors to how we're doing. And X-Men really showcases that in a lot of its storytelling. That Storm, for instance, doesn't necessarily have, clinical claustrophobia or PTSD. But if you look into Storm's history, that there are events and experiences that might naturally lead her to feel phobic and fearful and suspicious, and kind of integrate that into who she is. And so there's a really kind of nice way of balancing what what I think traditional psychology would say, like, this is disorder, this is illness, this is someone unwell. And the storytelling is more like, can we just take a look at the bigger social forces amongst or on these folks who are really just trying to exist? And I think that storytelling happens to be pretty sophisticated, but kind of given to us in this animation and with all the blasts and the colors and the explosions. So it's a really nice way to tell that story. I'd rather tell that story through X-Men than through like a textbook in my course on liberation psychology, right?
And if I can jump in, a thing that also, we kind of gloss over it, but the core of the X-Men, you're born, you hit puberty, adolescence, and your body starts doing all kinds of stuff. I think everyone can relate to that. And then on top of that, in the X-Men universe, some of you got a mutation, and it starts to, I think that is so relatable to anybody who's lived. And I think that also, with the X-Men, was such a powerful way to realize, okay, there's other folks kind of going through the same stuff. Maybe they've got neat powers, but okay, they're surviving in a way. Okay, seeing it somewhere distant. Okay, that's my window into a possible universe where this is going to be okay.
And what's interesting too is when you talk about the world of the mutants in general, even within themselves, some have useful powers, and others, like, I shoot cookie dough out of my, like, there's just no, which could be a very useful power, by the way. I take that reference back, or that one back. But yeah, like, even those characters have to decide, even within their own factions, how to treat one another, which I think brings us to really the two ideologies of Charles Xavier and Magneto. Both of them very much want the same thing, the liberation of mutants, and in some, Charles wants to take it a step further and say, I want to peacefully coexist with human beings. Whose side are you on? I mean, it's an argument you can easily see both sides. David, I want to ask you, where do you stand on Xavier and Magneto?
I want to say first that Cyclops is right. It's a hard thing. I mean, I certainly as a kid and growing up, it was Xavier's dream. That's the dream that we followed. As I became older, and I think this is one of the beauties of X-Men and X-Men comics as well, as I became older, you begin to understand where Magneto's coming from. Obviously, his methods and the end results, the destruction that he brings with him are not cool, but you begin to understand why he is the way he is, not just, being his family in an internment camp, what happened to his family afterwards. As we learn those things, we can see where he comes from. And then, for me, through the 90s and the early 2000s, as X-Men in the comics continued to mature and the ground shifted. I mean, Magneto was the leader of the X-Men for a long time when I was a kid in the 80s. This is part of what we're exploring in X-Men 97 now. Xavier disappears for long periods of time. The dream is handed to Scott for a while, who, as much as I love him, fumbles it a whole bunch. And all of that's very relatable and very human. One of the things that I loved about the X-Men as they resolve is that those dreams start to intertwine, moving in and out of each other. As you say, they're not different dreams, but they're informed by the people who are carrying them. And I think that's really important too. So I guess whose side am I on? I hope for Xavier's dream. But when that dream is carried, it changes with the time that it exists and with the people who carry it.
JB, how about you?
Magneto was right. But I do appreciate where you come from as well. I've really grown with the X-Men and obviously understanding the whole theological and psychological argument of what it means to be a mutant in a world where humans hate them and the prejudice that's baked into society. It's so crucial to understand how different people can perceive it. Magneto comes from a place of deep trauma, which honestly, like Cyclops, Jean Grey, a lot of these characters explore their mutant abilities for the first time in the worst moment of their lives. And for Magneto, I don't know if there's a worse instance of beginning to realize how different you are when you're already different in the first place. So I understand his strife and his struggle, but I do also wish for Xavier's dream to be realized without the violence and carnage that inevitably has to happen. But unfortunately, in some instances, violence is required to move the needle. And I think Magneto tends to do that.
Julia?
My actual mutation is that cilantro tastes like soap. So I think I'm down with Callisto. It's like, again, 30 years since we were given the opportunity, I was given the chance to write on what became X-Men, the animated series, and 30 years of comic books before that. We're now 60 years of these stories, this incredible sandbox in which to tell these kinds of stories. And we as human beings are still going at each other in the ugliest ways. I'm older than some of you. Things have gotten better. Some things have changed that in my lifetime I never thought could change. And I'm thrilled that those things have happened. But there is still so much ugliness out there that it continues to be heartbreaking.
Well, if I can fudge the answer, my favorite part of writing for X-Men was setting up the fact that Xavier and Magneto had a bromance.
Yeah.
That they were best friends for life and respected each other, and that was the way to keep, because the question's never going to go away, one side or the other side. Those are kind of eternal questions that go back 3,000 years if you enjoy old literature, and they will continue to go on to our grandchildren and their grandchildren. But having two characters that interact the way that the two did, that was what fascinated me, and I knew neither one was ever going to win, but putting them at each other for 76 stories was the favorite thing for me. And so I'm sorry, I can't pick a side.
No?
It's interesting because the way I see it is that these are portrayals of very realistic perspectives in the social justice movement. And really, we need everyone involved at all these different spokes of the movement. So you're actually seeing you see these two sides of it. You also have other characters like Cyclops and like Beast who are participating in their own way in pushing the needle. I do have to say that Magneto reminds us that to dismantle this really powerful oppressive system, you have to get nasty. You have to be destructive. You have to get gnarly. You need to be loud. You need to be, in his case, you need to be bold and brave and sacrifice. And I think that's relatable, especially for some people who feel like, I've tried the pacifist way. I've tried the coexistence. I've tried sanctuary. Isn't sanctuary just the same thing as internment? How is this different for us, right? So it just raises a lot of really important, social issues that still weigh heavy on us. What is the right way? What is the right way to protest? What is the right way to make change? I just appreciate Beast's way. I'm not sure if it's going to be effective, but we're covering this on the show. Right now, he's still in jail. We're like several episodes. You're like episode 7, right? This poor man's still in jail, passively, reading Shakespeare, and he says, I'm just going to follow the process. I'm not going to have an upheaval. I'm not going to be violent toward my captors. I'm not going to get rowdy. I've been incarcerated. I am owed due process, and it's an interesting thing to witness that and to like just be right with him and align, and then think, I don't know. Are you going to get due process? It's an exercise for all of us around how we feel about where we're standing with this. And I think that exercise is the most powerful part of this, rather than picking a side necessarily.
No, pick a side right now.
No, the idea of bringing in civil disobedience in the case of Beast's decision to stay in jail, they can break him out plenty of times. He's offered many opportunities. Yeah. But no, he is making that point. Which, again, this is a kid's Saturday morning show. And yet, dealing with these big issues, I think it's important that those kinds of things got raised.
Well, and I'll say, too, I was in college when this series came out. And my friends and I, nerds all along, Dungeons and Dragons and comic book people and in the sciences and in theater, we talked about this. So I wasn't a kid in front of the TV. We were becoming adults and doing so with the help of the X-Men again. And so it was meaningful to us, too. It was important.
And the series treats Charles a little differently than writers of the comics treat Charles. Sometimes one would say he might be the ultimate villain of the Marvel Universe in some ways.
Okay.
100%, I think. Yeah.
Watching this back, can we just say, watching this back, when we're pitting them against each other and we say, Magneto has such destructive methods, Professor X, yes, we are. Professor X employs some activities using his powers that have me question his respect of other people's rights. So there's almost this, I don't know, I wouldn't be so bold as to call it re-traumatization or sort of like reliving the trauma that is happening to the X-Men, but when he's not getting consent to employ these sort of like mind treatments and like probing people's minds without asking and going into their past and then weaponizing their histories and, in terms of Magneto, his own trauma from the Holocaust to make him do a thing, it really makes, it blurs the line again. We kind of get into that gray of, well, now you're employing the methods that you claim your oppressors are doing to you. How did we get here? But I have empathy for that because, maybe that's what they're experiencing and maybe they know, maybe this works. This creates fear. This creates the ability to control. This is what persecution looks like.
Poor Scott, how many siblings does he have that he doesn't even know about?
Yeah, I mean,
he doesn't remember them at all.
And then carrying out that same trauma again, saving people without their consent through AVX. It's a circle. It's a cycle. Yeah.
I do want to ask you, David, because you have brought up Cyclops, Scott Summers, and because I know you are such a fan, he is seen as a very prototypical hero. But he also is shown, as you said, occasionally he'll fumble, and he might be too rigid, or he may not see nuance. Talk about him as a role model, especially for you, because I know you see him as a beacon.
Yeah, well, I think the big thing for me, for especially for fictional heroes who become role models or you treat as role models, when a fictional hero is outlined and drawn and written as a real person with failings and accomplishments, I think, so I guess I should say, I think that Scott Summers is a role model, Cyclops is a role model, but only if you take in not only his successes in leadership, but also his failures. Scott has to learn from successes and failures, depending upon who's writing them. Of course, we all know how comic books work, that is greater or lesser. But if we're going to look to those characters as role models as well, we also have to look to their failures to find where we can do better or where we can try to do better. That example is set for us. I'm watching X-Men 97 right now, of course, and I don't want to spoil things for people who aren't caught up, but there's a moment in the most recent episode where Scott is asked a very direct question that he should be able to answer, or the person asking it feels like he should be able to answer. And the way that this is portrayed in this just extraordinarily animated moment of Scott not being able to answer, not being able to directly answer the question to a person who means so much to him, because he's beset on all sides by conflicting information and conflicting pressures and the loss of his mentor and Magneto leading the X-Men and now this new moment. And even the best of leaders isn't the best of leaders all the time. And this is a critical moment for Scott, and it was in the comics as well, obviously framed differently, where he fumbles. He fails some of the people, at least, that he's caring for. And that's a reality. A role model isn't somebody who's right all the time, or who leads properly all the time. A role model is somebody who learns and grows as new things are presented to them. And I think whether it's the comics or these wonderful series, I think Scott is a role model. Again, for me, Cyclops is right.
That's fair. So in the world of like Beatles versus Elvis, there's Scott versus Logan, and
Sure.
you're definitely.
I mean, if we want to talk about that, that's a whole different discussion.
So the X-Men consists obviously of a rotating ensemble of heroes. I want to ask you, what are the benefits of focusing on a team of heroes versus a single protagonist like a Batman who may have a Bat family, but let's be honest, he gives them busy work while he can be the only one that does things, or Spider-Man or someone like that.
For me, being the person responsible for coming up with the writers with the 76 episodes we came up with, I mean, that was, to me, it was far and away the hardest part of doing the show. Because once we decided on a story, like you say, the Beast story with the blind girl, we knew we had a bunch of writers and artists that could do that well. But what 76 stories out of 76,000 you could tell, that was the hardest story. I mean, the hardest part. And for me, having 8 or 9 people that we were sharing the screen time with made my life much easier. Because, okay, we'd have an intense rogue story, like is she going to give up her powers and so that she can touch people in the episode The Cure. Whatever it is, spend an episode or two with her, spend an episode with Cyclops. Let us provide variety and let us get much deeper into all of their characters. I know people have done a couple hundred Batman episodes and have done a couple hundred Spider-Man episodes, but I can't imagine coming up with 200 different corners of the single person's personality. If you got 8 or 9 people, you're way ahead. And we even would have guest people and family members, or getting in deeply into the lives of the villains like Sinister or Magneto. That allowed us to provide variety in the storytelling without feeling like we're going to do, the 19th story of Wolverine getting mad and leaving the X-Men. You guys would have gotten really tired of that. So it was a real gift to me to have a big cast.
And if I can add to that, something I really love about X-Men, probably the reason why it was my favorite show as a kid, was the representation that the show offered. Having that large crew, that large cast of people meant that I could watch an episode about someone who looked like me, someone like Storm, or I could watch an episode about someone like Rogue, who I loved and had nothing in common with. And I could just enjoy that no matter what episode it was, there was going to be an element that was new and novel and just exciting in that way.
We see a lot of different ways that these characters regulate their emotions, and they're all right. There's no wrong way to regulate your emotion, but when there's a tragedy, for instance, Wolverine is externalizing. It's just sort of like how his powers are, right? So his emotion regulation is to lash out. Cyclops, on the other hand, internalizes and self-blames and self-doubts and does this sort of mental gymnastics and time travel. What could I have done better? How could I be a better leader? It's all really up here, ruminative type of thoughts. And then Beast, just might openly sob. And all of this is enough. All of this is right. And I think to have all those different reactions, especially if you're kind of working on your own sense of self and how you're dealing with your own emotions, some of these tough emotions about how you're dealing with tragedy or loss and grief, they're all there and they're all right, So I really appreciate those elements of having the variety, the full cast there to kind of demonstrate that for us.
One quick behind the scenes element of the original X-Men animated series, because it's easy to say, 76 episodes, yeah, it was la 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 la. It wasn't. You were offered 13 episodes because everyone above Margaret Lesh at Fox was convinced it was going to fail. But she was given 13, and that was the complete episode order. By the end of which, when you were done with all the scripts, we were all let go.
The entire creative staff was let go.
Because the assumption was it's not going to work. So you had those first 13 to create and lay out the world of the X-Men from the comic books to introduce to an audience who back then could have told you, okay, yeah, I know Batman, I know Wonder Woman, I know Spider-Man, but introducing the X-Men, it was not, this was a long time ago, but most folks didn't know who they were. So you had those 13 episodes. The show, fortunately, was successful, and then you came back with a second set, and it's like, okay, you've explored the group dynamic a lot in that first 13, setting it up. And you made the conscious decision then to have Charles go off to the Savage Land, and that afforded the opportunity to start exploring each team member differently in their own kind of story, and then the rest of the seasons rolled out from there. But just so you understand how it played out, it wasn't a real great master plan. It was just 13, you get 13 more, whee, okay.
I do want to open up the panel for questions. There is a mic here, so please feel free to. There we go. There are people with strategic seating. And just so you know, we've only got about 10 minutes, so we'll try to get through as many as we can.
Short questions.
Hi, guys. The question is, if you were tasked with making a live-action movie, which story would you pull from?
Which story, from the books or from?
Yeah, or would you make your own story?
Well, just again, different people have different backgrounds. I think the people you'll speak to the new show. Those guys seem to know all 60 years of it. I didn't. So I think try to come up with a fresh story and use elements from the world. But that was our attitude for the first series. I think it's hard to imagine, but the first 26 episodes, the only thing that was a direct adaptation was Days of Future Past.
Yeah.
Although I'll jump in and say, if you folks remember the two-parter called One Man's Worth, which you referenced, where they go back in time to save Xavier from being killed before he forms the X-Men, boy, that'd be fun.
Yeah.
That'd be a fun feature. Woo!
This is a deep cut reference I'm about to make, but my favorite X-Men character is someone who literally can't be remembered, called Forget-Me-Not, if anyone's familiar with that character. I would love to make an X-Men movie about this character. Because in the canon, there's the idea that he's in every story, in every arc, and the X-Men can never remember he's one of the members of the team. Xavier has to mentally remind the team often, once a month, that he exists.
The opposite of what Xavier normally does, taking away your memories of. For me, I think if I were given this license to do it as a writer, I would make a stab anyway at God Loves, Man Kills. I think one of the most extraordinary comic stories ever written, not just for the X-Men, and I think it deserves a new audience. Please go read that if you don't know God Loves, Man Kills, but if I was going to make a movie, I would be trying to do that.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much. Given what you guys have discussed about the methods or ideals of Magneto versus Charles Xavier and the context of social justice, could you argue that Magneto is the more human of the two of them?
I don't know about more human. He might be. People might think that Charles is over idealistic and naive. They might deprecate him in that way, but I think both impulses from both men are equally valid and equally human. They're just the other side of the spectrum from each other.
Thank you.
Hi there. Excuse me, Eric. First, just want to say I had a nice conversation with you at Comic-Con in the lobby a couple years back. Got this hat from you there. But then a quick question for you all, other than maybe David, and a quick question: who is your favorite X-Men character or villain? Of course, we know who David's is already.
David, you want us to?
Not besides the character I just mentioned. I am a Storm person, ride or die forever. I'm not going to apologize for it. I love her. She is everything to me.
As a writer on the show, Beast was the most gratifying, satisfying to write for, because we got to use Bartlett's book of quotations to look up obscure things, because there was no internet back then. And he was the smartest, most romantic damage poet soul. So,
And of all people, for me, with all his weaknesses, Charles Xavier, because there were 20 different people that wrote for our show for me, and I had to try to herd cats and make them all work together and deal with each other, and so I felt very much like the guy in charge of the X-Men.
Drea?
Oh gosh, it's so hard to choose. I like my monsters, I love Beast. I love Nightcrawler, Mystique. Is it just I like all the blue ones? I love Mystique. I love Mystique. But I think it's for Mystique especially. It's it's the boldness. It's like, this is who I am, right? Like somehow the inability to pass also leads to some great strengths in showing up as a mutant and what that means for that character. And Nightcrawler, of course, just the backstory for Nightcrawler is beautiful, but that the proximity, in some cases even having to hug you, to bamf with you and move you to safety is such an interesting, tremendous gesture, right? So I like all those characters.
Hello. Hello, Eric and Julia. I know that it's been overwhelming, the positive appreciation of the show, even the new one, right? But I do follow you online. And we saw the post of some people being mean and you told them to calm down or whatnot. And here's the thing: you have a standing army right now in WonderCon.
Yeah.
You can go to me, my X-Men. Yeah. So go ahead. So tell them why it's not good to be bullying, for these shows, because people put so much effort into them. Go ahead. To me, my X-Men, Julia.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Folks, I'm being told we've got time for one more question.
Which character or characters would you like to see? Oh, what do you want to?
Sorry. Oh, I thought you...
No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
We just thanked you.
Which character or characters would you like to see more of a psychological profile at some point?
You might have more influence on this, JB.
I'll give the briefest spoiler. People have seen the show, right? The new show? Yeah. Okay, just the end of the third episode, you see Storm, and I think we're going to see a little bit more of Storm, and there's going to be some breakdowns of how she came to be, who she is as a person. That's the character I think is going to get explored properly in the coming episodes.
Thank you.
I want to run down the line, starting with David. Why don't you tell the good folks where they can find you online?
If you want to follow me online, you can find me at David Nett pretty much everywhere except for X, which I'm not on anymore. You can find me there. Hero's Journey LA is our gym, Hero's Journey Fitness. That's my daughter back there expressing her need for you to follow that. And then I've got a new project out about role-playing games and recapturing the wonder that we had when we began to play them, called ProgCoreFantasy.com. You can check us out there.
You can find me at JB from Everywhere on Instagram and Twitter. I refuse to call it the other name. And I'm also on Letterboxd, JB Ballard.
Nice. as old as I am and as long as I've been doing it, I should be a lot better at social media. But Eric and I are on X-Men TAS, which is for X-Men the Animated Series.
Yeah.
And we've got that on whatever Twitter is now, and Instagram, and I'm trying to think where else.
Our website.
Our website. We have a website that we're trying to get spruced up.
Yeah.
So, and on all our different profiles, we also have an email on those profiles. So if you want to email us about perhaps a book,
Yeah, and
or a hat.
if you're ever interested in either of the books, we can sell and send you them personalized signed
Yeah.
copies from the house. So feel free to order a dozen for your friends.
You can find me on social media. Dr. Drea Psychology is my handle. I also have a website, drdreapsychology.com, where you can find some of our podcast episodes. I write about stuff. I work with Warner Brothers sometimes, Marvel, Disney. The show that we have together is the Arkham Sessions. And yes, we are covering X-Men. So if you know about Arkham Asylum, yes, that's a DC reference. But we've been covering X-Men, the animated series. And yeah, that's where you can find me.
You can find the Arkham Sessions at on whatever Twitter is at Arkham Sessions, and on Instagram at the Arkham Sessions. Come follow us on Facebook and all that other good stuff. In the meantime, have an amazing rest of your WonderCon 2024.
Me too.